Hey friends, I'm Casey and this is Let's Tell Their Story. In the United States alone, over the past 40 years, over 200,000 cases have gone unsolved. Whether that be missing persons, unsolved murders, or unsolved suspicious deaths, I'm here to tell you the stories about the cases that were never solved. I hope I can bring light to these cold cases that just sit and collect dust. I go through every case with as much research as I possibly can and give you the knowledge that I was able to find. So grab your warmest blanket, find a comfy spot to relax, and let me tell you a story. If you're doing chores like washing dishes, laundry, or even at work, it's okay. You can listen to Story Time. Today I'm going to be discussing the strange disappearances of Kimberly Lauren Raymer and William Charles Fikes Jr. I'll be beginning with William Charles Fikes, who went by Pete. Not sure where Pete came from, but I guess it's one way not to have yourself mixed up with your father. Not much information is known about Pete as a young kid, but March 4th, 1960, he was appointed as conservation officer in Pickens County after graduating from the Highway Patrol Recruit School of Alabama Police Academy. And this is where we begin Pete's story, right after I let you know that Pete was born December 30th, 1935, to Mr. and Mrs. William F. Fikes, since women really didn't have a say or a first name when they got married. They went by their husband's name, so they'd be Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so. On November 29th, 1977, Pete left his grandmother's house in Jasper, heading back to his home in Burroughs Crossing, about 8 miles away, in his dad's 1972 Plymouth Valiant. I looked up the history of the weather that day, and from about 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. on that morning, about every half hour or so, the temp would go from 60 degrees to 0 degrees and back again. So the roads were probably icy at the time of Pete's departure from his grandmother's home. So later that day, when the weather finally straightened up, Pete's parents went to visit Pete and probably their granddaughters, since Pete did have 3 daughters, and I couldn't find any information on whether or not Pete was married, divorced, or widowed anywhere, and trust me, I looked. Pete wasn't there when they had gotten there, and they hadn't heard anything from him at all. With the roads being icy that morning, Mr. and Mrs. Fikes went out looking for Pete, fearing that he may have ran off the road and was in some kind of accident. Mr. Fikes searched up and down the roads of Walker County looking for his 1972 Plymouth Valiant and his son for the next 3 days. And this is when he finally informs the Jasper Police Department and Walker County Sheriffs that Pete hasn't been seen or heard from for the past 3 days. The search for Pete pretty much came and went, and on February 24th, 1977, a Jasper Police Department Major, George Guthrie, came across a bill of sale while going through the vehicle transfer records at the Jefferson County Probate Office, and came across a 1972 Plymouth Valiant that belonged to William F. Fikes. The bill of sale had been signed and dated on November 30th, 1976, one day after Pete had gone missing. A man from Cahaba Heights had bought the car from 3 men for $200, which would be around $1,000 today in today's money. Investigators had the car impounded and searched for fingerprints and other possible evidence that they may find, and they did find some dried blood inside the car. Now that blood was found in the car, Pete's parents and the investigators feared the worst possible outcome now. After the car had been located and impounded, 3 men were taken into custody for questioning, and it was determined that a man named James Arthur Gregg was responsible for forging the bill of sale and sold the car to the man in Cahaba Heights. James was later charged with forgery and buying, receiving, and concealing stolen property. But there still wasn't any answers as to where Pete may be at. At some point, James Gregg, lets the investigators know that Pete was murdered by one of the other men that was with him when he forged and sold the car, and that they concealed Pete's remains. And even after exhausting searches by volunteers and the investigators, no remains were found in the surrounding areas. So since there weren't any remains found, the investigators didn't pursue charges other than the forgery charges. William, Pete's father, wanted answers and closure, and he was persistent, if not relentless, in his pursuit for justice. This is also about the time that Mr. Fikes pays a bond of $1,500 to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office to get his car returned, and a reward of $1,500 that would be supplemented later to a $9,000 reward by Governor Bob Riley. In today's value, the reward went from roughly $46,000 to $78,000, which also means that Mr. Fikes basically spent today's money of $7,471.19 just to get his car out of the impound. Then in September of 1980, a man from Sispy is at the dump site and happens to come across a human skull. The skull had been sent off to the state toxicologist, and they determined it to be that of Pete's. When the toxicologist examined the skull in one of the fractures, they found dried blood, and they believed it would match the dried blood that was found in the Plymouth. The toxicologist believed that Pete was killed by being struck in the back of the head with a blunt object, or otherwise known as blunt force trauma. Now, in 1982, Alabama Bureau of Investigation agent Leon Hampton and Walker County investigator Frank Cole were announced by Walker County Sheriff Jack Trotter that they had made an arrest with the disappearance and death of William Charles Pete Fikes. The arrest was of a 24-year-old man, Perry Mixon, an inmate at Staten Correctional Center in Elmore County, on charges of robbery and murder in connection with Pete's death. However, Mixon was already serving a 15-year sentence for second-degree theft. He basically had a shitload of stolen jewelry and stolen items from a drugstore, and since this wasn't his first offense, Circuit Judge Charles Crowder gave him a 15-year sentence under the Habitual Offenders Act, another HOA you probably don't want anything to do with. So if this wasn't Mixon's first offense, what's the importance of bringing it up? Well, I'll tell you, on June 7th, 1976, Mixon had pled guilty to burglary and received stolen property and is given a 2-year sentence. Then in mid-June of 1979, he's convicted of receiving and concealing stolen property. It's unclear what the property was, and he received 1 year and 1 day for this conviction. There is some discrepancy on whether or not Mixon was to serve the sentences concurrently, if he started to serve his sentences immediately, or even if he served the full amount of the sentences, which leaves at least one of his daughters, Martha, who was only 3 or 4 at the time of Pete's disappearance, wondering, will the family's search for closure ever really end? Was Pete's justice served with enough investigation? And even though investigators closed the case, for Martha, who hangs onto a letter from her dad and a photograph of her and Pete together, she hasn't found closure because she doesn't feel justice has truly been served. And that's a little story on William Charles Pete Fikes that I could find. Going to be moving on to Kimberly. Born May 18th, 1980, to Kenneth and Susan Raymer, a little girl that they named Kimberly Lauren Raymer. When Ken and Sue divorced, Kim as they called her, lived with her dad, where she had attended the op school, and in August of 1997, she would be going into her senior year at op high school. Kim was a straight-A student, a cheerleader, and played second base for the high school softball team. She had future plans of going on to college and major in physical therapy at the University of South Alabama. On August 15th, 1997, Ken and Sue's lives were about to change, and not for the better. That day, Kim had her senior pictures taken that afternoon, followed by playing in a softball game, casually hanging out with her friends, and then to spend time with her boyfriend. She would arrive home just before midnight, where a neighbor had allegedly seen her pull into the driveway. Ken had been staying at his girlfriend's house the night of the 15th, so Kimberly was home alone that night. She was 17 years old, so don't come at me or her parents about being left alone. Anywho, Ken arrived home at approximately 6 a.m. that Saturday morning, and since Kim's car was at home, he had assumed that she was still asleep and hadn't checked on her, since the two of them did have an understanding that if they were not going to be home, to leave a note. Remember, this is 1997 and cell phones were not a back pocket staple yet. Really, only the elite had them at this time, and that's exactly what Ken did. He left a note saying that he was going golfing. However, Kim wasn't always so great about leaving a note to teenagers. Ken gets back from his golfing outing, and Kim still wasn't home at this time. He must have actually checked in her bedroom, and she wasn't there. Again, no note about her whereabouts, so Ken assumed that Sue, her mother, had picked their daughter up and they had gone shopping, and that Kim was staying the night at Sue's, which she had done on occasion. When Sunday morning came around, Ken called Sue asking when Kim would be home. Sue informed Ken that she hadn't been with her, and every parent's dreaded nightmare just came a reality to them. They began calling Kim's friends and her boyfriend, but none of them had seen nor spoken to her since Friday night. This is when Ken calls the police department and reports Kim missing. With Op being a small town of around 6,900 residents, it didn't take long for word to travel, and while Ken and Sue were waiting for the arrival of the Op police department, friends of Kim swarmed Ken Raymer's home. When the Op police department had gotten there, they were taken to Kim's room that was in a complete disarray. Her shoes were scattered, the bed was disheveled, and pictures had been knocked off the wall of not just in her bedroom, but also pictures that hung in the hallway. The Op police department, which I'm going to refer to from here on out as the OPD, knew they weren't equipped to handle the case in front of them. This was a safe town, and the illusion had just been their illusion of a safe town had just completely been shattered. So they called in immediate assistance from the FBI, and it was a good thing that they called them earlier, because if they hadn't, when they did, they eventually would have had to. This will become something that has to do with state lines, why FBI would have had to been called if they hadn't been called already. Searches began for Kim, but nothing turned up to where Kim may have disappeared to or whom she disappeared with. Phone records had shown that the night they believed Kim to be abducted, there were multiple calls made to a house number in Florida that Kim wouldn't have been familiar with. This had led the FBI and OPD to the conclusion that the person or persons responsible for Kim's disappearance made those phone calls to Florida. Ballsy move, if you ask me, and since now there was a link over state lines, whether the OPD hadn't gotten a hold of the FBI earlier, now now it's considered federal jurisdiction considering it's over state lines. Both areas in Alabama and Florida had multiple locations searched. Planes searched, volunteers covered miles, missing person posters were given out by family and friends. Truck drivers would pick up these posters by the hundreds and had hung them throughout the country. Yet, Kim was still missing. School began and things just weren't the same in the small town of Opp. As all too well aware of Kim's disappearance, abduction, the safe town didn't feel so safe anymore, and everyone was worried whether they would be the next target, or if their children were going to be the next target. In December of that year, Ken and Sue held a press conference begging for help to find Kim and to let everybody know she was still missing. This is also when an award was offered and any information would help, as they were certain someone knew something. Months went by and nothing until May 18th, 1998, Kim's 18th birthday. A tip came into the FBI that Kim's remains would be found in the Walton County Pond, known as the Steep Hole in Leonia, Florida, where Kim's mom, Sue, was actually originally from. She was actually originally from that town in Florida. It was located 10 miles from the Alabama state line and only 30 miles from Ken Remier's house in Opp. The area was currently owned by a logging company that had put up a no trespassing sign throughout the property, and a locked gate. With the presence of beer bottles scattered about, the logging company must have felt security measures needed to be put in place since it seemed to be a hot spot for partying. The FBI felt that this was the most credible tip they had gotten so far. They sent in cadaver dogs that did pick up a scent of human remains, so the dive team went in exploring the 35 feet depths of this water basin in murky waters where visibility was pretty much zero, so they were feeling around and using metal detectors hoping to get a hit on either Kim's gold bracelet or her anklet that she was wearing when she disappeared. Unfortunately, they found nothing to indicate that she had ever been there. Then over the years, the FBI and local law enforcement would conduct hundreds more searches in water and on land. Sue, Kim's mother, spent every weekend going through wooded areas looking for Kim. And even with tips coming in, the tips really hadn't led anywhere until July of 2006, when a tip came in saying that Kim had fallen into the water of a sinkhole near Ponce de Leon. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, in Florida. This tip seemed to be a very hot lead to the investigators since, remember those phone calls made from the Raymer house the night of Kim's disappearance? They were made to Ponce de Leon area. So 10 divers spent 35 hours searching the 55 feet deep and 300 feet across hole, only to once again come up empty-handed. This prompted a few more tips to the FBI, and they followed up every lead, only to keep coming up with no answers and just more questions. Then in 2015, a detailed tip came into the police about Kim's remains being found behind an abandoned house in Coffee County off County Road 412 near the Covington County line. There was a well behind the property of the house the house was literally falling apart. So they brought in a backhoe and dug down more than 30 feet in this well, only to find nothing that suggested that Kim had ever been there. There are rumors as to who is responsible for her disappearance, and that, as of right now, is all they are, is just rumors. The FBI won't publicly say they have potential suspects, but they are confident that there are people in Opp that know what happened to Kimberly, and that someday they will come forward. And that is the story of Kimberly Lauren Ramier. The end.